Why hello there! Brent here with Bring Your Own Tools. On today's episode, we are completely transforming this small bathroom with tile. If you want to learn how to do it, keep watching. Let's get started. Woo! This is the inside of our beautiful shower that we just showed the entire process on start to finish on how to get to this point, waterproofing and all. Now it's time to tile, and the first step is to clean up that shower pan before installing any tile. Now if you're just looking for a video on how to tile, this is the perfect video for you. But if you want to see how we got to this point, I will make sure and leave a link in the description box below of this video, as well as a card right above. But we have a lot of tiling to get to, so let's get right to it. And the first thing to do is to get a tile wet saw cutter. This is very important, especially with mosaics like this, because it makes it really easy to cut straight lines all the way across. And this is a black mosaic porcelain tile that, as you can see, cuts like butter with this wet saw tile cutter. Now you do obviously have to be careful with a tile cutter because it is still a saw. However, it's a much safer saw than your generic table saw, chop saw, or circular saw. That's because this blade doesn't have teeth like those saws do. It has a rounded diamond blade, which is actually quite safe and not prone to cutting your fingers because your fingers are too soft. Just still be careful. When tiling a shower pan, I always highly suggest doing a dry fit first, because that way you know exactly the amount of tiles that you have to use for the shower pan, and it makes the installation process extremely quick and easy because you have all of your tiles already cut. I also do suggest cutting the pieces for your shower drain ahead of time as well, because those are time consuming, and when you're doing thin set, you want to try and do it in a timely manner. I trace a circle where the drain is and then position the drain grate exactly where it needs to be. That way I know for certain exactly where I need to cut these tiles. A wet saw is a perfect saw to cut these type of pieces because you're really able to get very accurate cuts on those lines, as well as getting even rounded corners like so. As for thinset, I'm using Pro Light Thinset by Custom, and this is a nice higher quality thinset because it actually has and provides more bond strength, especially on vertical surfaces, which is definitely going to be important in the very near future. When applying thinset to your shower pan, one thing I would suggest is wetting the shower pan down slightly with a damp cloth or damp sponge. We do this because we want to make sure that the thinset doesn't dry too quickly on the bottom side before we install our tile. However, one of the most important things to do before installing your tile is to make sure you have the proper gauged trowel for your tile. Because if you don't have the proper gauge trowel, you might have too much thinset or you might have too little thinset when applying your tile. For this type of tile, I'm using a 3/16 inch V-notch trowel that really provides an adequate amount of thinset, but it also makes sure that the thinset isn't just spewing out the sides of our tile when installing, because that's just going to be very messy to clean up, and the less mess we have to clean up, the better. This is a Schluter shower pan, and we are using a Schluter shower drain to accompany it because it's the proper system to use. That means we have to bury this black ring within the thinset first, and then insert our drain and position it properly so it all drains straight. As you're installing tile around the drain, the one thing to keep in mind is the fact that the drain itself should be the lowest point within the shower pan. If it's not the lowest point, that means the water most likely can't fully drain out of the shower every single time. Therefore, that drain in the very center should be the lowest point, or at least in line with those tiles that are right next to it, which are the lowest point. Now luckily for us, our shower pan was already pre-sloped, so just grabbing a level to guarantee that all four sides are flowing downwards towards the drain is key and very simple with the shower pan. Once you like the positioning, go ahead and grab a wet sponge and just wipe off any of the excess thinset that is on the tile, because it's going to be a lot easier to remove that thinset now than later. The shower pan had smaller 2-inch wide hexagon tiles, but for the floor in the bathroom we wanted to go with a similar look that would complement the shower pan, but something that's a little bit bigger would also make it a little bit less busy, and therefore these hexagon tiles are 4 inches wide. I did a quick dry fit layout to determine how I wanted each one of these tiles to be laid out and then cut them accordingly. Now you don't have to cut all of these like I did with the shower pan, but it is nice to cut some of these larger areas that are going to be more difficult prior to applying your thin set. These tiles are the areas that are going to be right around our toilet drain, which are a little bit more difficult, and I do use some tile nippers to nip off some of the areas that are just too hard for the tile saw to get to, and it's not like anyone's going to see these specific tiles because they're going to be under a toilet. As for applying the thin set on this portion, I still use my 3/16 inch notch trowel because I find it provides a perfect amount of thin set without getting too messy. As you lay the tile upon the thin set, try not to press down on them first because you do want to position a couple other pieces ahead of time so you know you have the correct layout for your tile before you press them permanently down, because they're a lot harder to move once you press down versus if they're just slightly laid upon the thin set. As you're installing these tiles, the one thing you do also really want to keep in mind is making sure you have the proper spacers for the tiles. The spacers for these floor tiles are 1/8 inch spacers, which are really important to have to make sure that the transition from mosaic piece to mosaic piece is aligned properly. And I assure you, if you don't have spacers, these mosaics can get out of hand quite quickly and out of alignment, and that's the last thing you want at this point. This was day 1 of tiling, so this was a busy day and we didn't quite get finished with the floor, but luckily the next day I had a helping hand.
Want to put it back in the box? Go ahead. Put it back in the box. Oh, wait, thank
girl,
you.
honey.
Good girl.
Yeah. Put them all back in the box.
Now put them all back in there.
No, maybe not that piece.
Yeah. All of them. All of them. Good job, sweetie. Yeah, here you go. Good job. You're such a big helper.
Quite the apprentice on my hands, and although she was not the biggest help, she was the cutest on site. For this project, we are transitioning from a hardwood floor to tile, and I always suggest using a transition strip for these locations, 1, because it's a professional look, and 2, it's going to protect your tile long term. I apply a bit of thin set down first, then lay the transition strip into the thin set and actually secure it with a couple screws so it doesn't wiggle on us. That way it can dry permanently in place, and then install our tile on top of that. We'll be discussing the transition strip more in the very near future because we're going to be using it on the shower.
Looking oh so good. Now let's do a little protection over here, and then we can start on our tile. A white wall shower tile, of course.
You definitely want to protect your shower pan before you install your wall tile because it will most certainly get quite messy with all the thin set and the grout you'll be installing before you even touch your shower pan again. I mix up some more thin set and start installing our subway tile. And the most important row, of course, when installing tile is the very bottom one, because if this one's not straight and not level, then none of the other ones are going to be. Which means take your time and due diligence when leveling out these first couple rows, and just know you're going to save a lot of extra time because the other rows are going to go much faster. And speaking of fast, if you want to cut your tiles fast, you should use a tile cutter like this. And all you have to do is insert the tile in, score it, and then press down, and it actually perfectly cuts these pieces. It's not perfect to the point where it's a beautiful finished edge, but in areas where it's going to be hidden, like the back side of this wall, they're perfect for all the pieces that we have to cut in these locations. Now the reason why these are faster is because you can actually have that tile cutter in the room right next to you, and you don't have to move from location to location and try and cut it with a wet saw, which takes more time to do. It's a much faster process if you're able to use that type of tile cutter in these specific locations, so just keep that in mind in the future. And as I said before, once you're off the ground and have those first couple rows done, it's a much faster process to install because you already have level, and all you have to do is install all of these beautiful subway tiles. The one thing that I also suggest grabbing is a laser level. As you can see, I'm using those to line up my seams because if you're like me and you're a bit of a perfectionist, you do want to make sure that those seams are straight all the way up and all the way down. And to do that and to make sure we have those seams lined up on every single row, all I have to do is grab that laser level, prop it up, and as long as it's aligned at the bottom and the top, we're good. As for tile, this is a white porcelain subway tile that I personally find beautiful and complements the tile floor that we just did, as well as the fact that a subway tile, in my personal opinion, really doesn't go out of style. And the last thing I want when installing a beautiful shower is to think that, ooh, this is going to be dated in 10 years. As we make our way up the wall, make sure you double check for levelness every few rows just to make sure that everything is still appropriately level. I never had to try and finagle our way through, but as you can see, if you do, you'll have a very consistent line at the very top of your ceiling. So we have this box, of course, but to make sure we have everything aligned, make sure our laser level's set, going across that section, and therefore we know exactly the height we need for these pieces, of course. Again, the laser level is one of those things that I absolutely love using because it comes in handy in so many different ways, and this was just another way of doing so. One thing to keep in mind is that you do want to install these box pieces prior to installing all the other ones. So I did install these pieces first, let it dry for that day, and then later on we'll come back to it and install the rest. But for now, we'll continue to be a tiling machine on all of the other walls. The trowel I used for these walls are actually different than the trowel that I used for the floor, and that's because we needed a bit more thin set for these walls, which is why we used a 1/4 inch notch trowel. As we made our way up to the mixing valve, this is a key piece of tile because the mixing valve cover doesn't cover a ton of space, and therefore those cuts need to be pretty tight. My trick when doing this is to just take a Sharpie and draw a rounded line so I know exactly where I need to cut. Then bring it over to the wet saw, and after I have the two sides accounted for, I then just do a series of plunge cuts all the way across, connecting both sides. Then I just use the side of the blade and score it so it makes it a bit more of an even look and feel. Then all you have to do is shim it up correctly and proceed to making your way up to the shower head. As I made my way up, I quickly realized that the hole itself is not actually in the center of the tile, it's on the edge, which did make things a little bit more difficult, but with a diamond hole saw drill bit, it made it extremely easy to cut as long as you have a steady hand. Like always, I will be leaving links in the description box below on all the tools and materials used in this video, so if you're interested in any of those, please check them out below. As we finished up the second wall, it feels good, however, of course, we need to move on to the next wall, which is our third wall, of course, and that's where our transition strip comes in handy as well. I pinpoint exactly where I want it to cut, and I'm actually able to use a diamond blade on my grinder, which doesn't provide the nicest cut, but it does the job, and you'll see how I cut them cleanly with a table saw later on. Now, because I mudded this seam earlier, I did sand it down smooth because I want to have a very smooth finish to apply this trim to. And once that's taken care of, I apply a nice heavy bit of thin set onto the wall, then install our trim piece and secure it snugly with a couple screws. I positioned it perfectly vertical with my lace level, and then also accounted for the fact that I wanted full pieces at this end spot, which is why there's fewer cuts at this location, and I'm able to use nice full pieces at both the front and the back side of this wall. The one thing we haven't really talked about yet, but I've used copious amounts of, is shims. So let's talk about them. Just for clarity purposes, I'm using 3 different types of shims now. I'm using your standard little star shim. I'm using a wedge shim, which I really like. It's tapered on one side compared to the other. And then I have a horseshoe shim.
These are really nice just because they're super easy to pull out and maneuver as needed. I'm trying to make sure we are all aligned side by side in the corners. So if we do need to make sure we are a hair up, hair lower, based upon how we maneuver all the way up, I can use the wedge shims because they're tapered.
And keep in mind that both the blue and green spacers are 16-inch spacers. They are smaller than the floor ones because the floor ones were actually 1/8 inch. And as I worked my way all the way up, it was really nice to have a wall that just didn't have any penetrations or holes or boxes because it made the tiling installation process extremely quick and easy. However, that left our last wall, which was of course the most difficult due to the fact that it's a half wall that's rounded and needs tile on all sides. Now we could have used our black transition trim at this location, but instead we used this porcelain 90-degree corner transition strip, which was really nice because it complemented the space, it was the same color, and wasn't the easiest to install but provided a nice look and feel in the end. As I worked my way up and finished off all the tiling on the inside of the shower, we can now move to outside of the shower. And we don't have a lot of tile on the outside, but it is a bit complicated due to how the layout is preceded. And it all starts with a piece like this. This piece is obviously positioned right outside of our shower ledge, and once we have these small pieces taken care of, we can then take that layout and move it all the way across our ledge. But before we do that, just don't forget that you might have to install a couple small pieces of black hexagon tiles at these types of locations if you want to make sure you don't have a very large grout line in the end. I install another piece of metal trim on the left side of the shower opening and then start installing our subway tile. Now I'm installing my subway tile on the bottom first because that way I can determine the height that I need for this specific section. Because remember, this ledge has to be angled downward into the shower. If it's not angled downward and it's flat, that means that water will actually puddle in this location and most likely will have some type of water intrusion issues, which is the last thing we want. Once I have the height determined on our shower curb, I can then proceed to working my way up the wall, and just remember that if those screws do get in the way, you can always take them out after you have it dried up for a bit. As we finish off the front side of the shower, I move my focus to our shower curb. Now the shower curb itself should be level on both sides. However, if you take your level and position it onto both pieces of trim, that means that it should be flowing into the shower and not level at any point. Then all you have to do is apply a very heavy bead of thinset, then position your metal trim accordingly and insert your tile in between your trim. This did take a little time to do to make sure that everything was shimmed out appropriately, but well worth the effort because this area is going to be one of the areas that's most prone to water intrusion. Once we have our ledge accounted for and taken care of, I can then install the rest of our tile for this half wall and be done with that section. But the only thing we have left is our box. Let's get to the box. I first install all of the outside pieces of the box, and those areas where I actually cut need to be perfectly aligned with the edge of the box. Now, you'll see why that makes sense in the very near future, but you want to make sure you have as perfect of cuts as possible at these locations because they're going to be very visible, and if there's any unevenness within this specific section, it's going to be quite noticeable because your eyesight is right there and it will be able to tell every single time. At least personally, that's what I want to avoid. So make sure you try and cut as cleanly as possible. And speaking of cuts, as I noted before, you can use your chop saw to cut this material because it's only aluminum. It makes a very nice mitered edge, and if you're trying to go for that look, it's a very professional look in the end. I position a nice heavy dose of thinset on both the top and the bottom first, then install those pieces, then install both sides. After I have all four positioned nicely and correctly, with a little bit of wiggle room in the end, I then start cutting and positioning all of my tile as needed on the bottom first and then the top. Now remember, the bottom does need to be slightly maneuvered downward into the shower because we don't want it flat. If it was flat, that would be more prone to water intrusion. And just like that, we can place our final tile in this entire shower. That feels good, and let's let it dry. Through the entire installation process, I have been trying to wipe down any of the excess thin set that I see. However, when it does dry and it dries hard on you, you want to take a standard house sponge and a utility knife to ensure that you don't have any thin set on the tile or in the grout lines that would be protruding past where the grout would be laid. If you do this the same day that you mix the grout, the chances are that it's going to be a lot easier for you to remove any of this, but if you wait, it's still very doable to remove. It's just going to take a little bit more effort, so keep that in mind. After I have all the surfaces completely cleaned, I can then start taping off some of the more prone areas of moisture. That's going to be in the corners, that's going to be at the very bottom of our steps and so forth, and for this, we need to use a sanded caulk. This is a sanded caulk that matches our grout that we'll be installing right after this. In the past, these areas would just be filled with your normal grout. However, more recently, we do know that these areas are more prone to movement and moisture, and therefore making sure you have a really high quality sanded caulk in these locations will definitely do better long term, because these areas, again, more prone to movement over time, and caulk is less likely to crack over time than grout. But as for grout, we are using a high quality SpectraLock 1 grout. Now this is a pre-mixed grout, and I assure you not all pre-mixes are the same. So make sure you're using a high quality product like Laticrete for your grout opportunities, like a shower that has quite a few grout lines, as you can see. For this premixed grout, you want to apply it in small sections and then wipe it off pretty consistently, because it does dry fairly quick and you don't want this type of high quality grout to dry too long before you start trying to remove it, because it will become difficult, I assure you. As for the washing process, you saw that I had 2 buckets of water. One of the buckets is going to be my main washing bucket, which is going to take off the vast majority of any of the excess grout that I need to remove. And once I have the vast majority taken care of, I then go back to the second bucket with the clean water as well as very clean sponge and remove the last little bit of film on the tile. Once I have all the grout taken care of on the walls in the shower, I can now proceed to moving on to our shower pan. You do want to tape off a majority of the area before you start using your caulk, and this again is the sanded caulk. However, this is a different color than the walls. That's because we're using a different color in the shower pan, and you should be using the same color of caulk in these locations as you do in your shower pan. After you remove the tape and let the caulk dry, you can proceed to your grout. And luckily for us, the grout on the shower pan is a lot easier to apply and install than the grout on the walls, because you're working on a floor, not a vertical surface. One item that I really found helpful when cleaning off the grout as well as applying it was to actually take a damp sponge before you grout anything and go over the surface first. If you go over the surface first with a slightly wet sponge and then start trying to squeeze in the grout into the crevices of your tile, that makes it a lot easier to remove as well for the cleaning process, which I truly appreciate. But guess what? Now that we have that taken care of, we are done with tile, of course. I'm absolutely in love with this color combination of the black hexagon with this white subway. It really stands out, looks sharp, looks beautiful, and is truly one beautiful, sexy beast. Now, obviously we're not done yet, but the icing on this cake is the amazing before and after shots that I'll be sharing with you at the very end of this video. But first, let's thank our sponsor this week, Hoover. With any of the sponsorships that I do on the channel, I'm very precise as to the companies that I want to work with. And with Hoover, it was just something that I had to do. Why? Because for the longest time, my nickname has been Hoover. You can guess as to why. But With this system, they sent over the Smart Wash pet control system because not only do I have a very large dog, but I also have a 14-month-old. Makes plenty of messes along the way, and as for carpets, it's perfect for a little carpet cleaning. As for the machine setup, it's quite simple. All you have to do is fill this specific jug with warm water, fill the solution tank with their deep cleaning and neutralizer solution, add some spot chaser into the wand for some really deep-seated carpet cleaning needs, and away you go. Whether it's the spots on your carpet that need a little bit extra love and care, or it's the whole carpet that needs to be completely cleaned and transformed, this machine does it all just by pushing it forward to clean and pulling it backwards to suck up all of that loose dirt and debris. And for some reason, I find it extremely satisfying just to see what was actually in our carpets, because it's not noticeable until you do something like this and truly realize, oh yeah, they were dirty. Whether it's rugs, carpets on your floors, or even in your own stairwell, this thing can take care of it all in a quick and orderly fashion, and that's something I always appreciate. If you want to see the amazing performance of this machine for yourself, I will make sure and leave a link in the description box below. But now, let's get to our amazing before and after for our shower. An amazing before and after is always satisfying in my book, and as you can see, this was a lot of hard work involved on this project, but man, oh man, what a beautiful transformation, and one that I'm truly proud to say is one beautiful, sexy beast. Oh yeah.